Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Kartik Hosanagar, who is a professor of technology at the Wharton School, and also heads up their AI and analytics project, which goes across a whole bunch of different faculty groups or departments at the Wharton School, and also the author of this book right here, which it's 5 years old now, but I was rereading it, and it's fine. There's not a lot on Gen AI, but everything in there is still very relevant and valid. And you could probably update it with a few, cut and paste. It would still have awesome stuff to say. And also, you've done a bunch of startups over the years, including this new one involving creativity and screenplays and Hollywood and so forth. Welcome, Kartik.
Thanks for having me, Greg. Great pleasure to be here.
So look, there's a lot we can talk about. You teach a course called Enabling Technologies. Are you still teaching that course? You've been doing that for a couple years?
Yeah, for about 20 years now. So yeah, I'm still teaching that. Every year the course looks different than the previous year.
Well, I can imagine, because every year they have to learn new stuff. And one of the things I do want to talk to you about is, we're both in the business of teaching, MBAs. And I like to say that MBAs, when we do it right, what we're doing is we're educating generalists. We're teaching people to be decision makers, right? And there used to be a department called decision science, you studied management science at Carnegie Mellon. So, management science, decision science, some people have this idea that this can be like a scientific enterprise. And so we're training these folks in this general science of management, but they also need to understand not only the domain in which they operate, but then all these tools and technologies. Is it possible? I mean, how do we train these folks so that they have enough of an understanding of technology that they can utilize it without themselves having to become technologists or technology experts?
Yeah, great question. I think it's not only possible, it's actually necessary in today's world. So, the example I like to share is, look at what happened when the whole internet wave happened and companies were getting digitized. And business executives, didn't matter which industry, which function you were in, you had to start picking up a little bit of, digital, and really into the organization, bring in a digital mindset into the organization. Companies that resisted paid a big price for it. So, for example, after the dot-com hype, when the dot-com bust happened, lots of companies kind of decided this is a fad. Let's shut things down. And even the ones that did do something in the digital internet space, the way many of them approached it was they hired these people that they called the dot-com people and put them in a separate building. Mm-hmm. And they said, oh, those are our dot-com people. And then it's business as usual for the regular folks. And they paid the price for that. Kmart, for example, which was a big retailer back in the day, doesn't exist today, was actually one of the early ones to set up a so-called dot-com division. And then, of course, they shut it down when the dot-com bust happened, and it was too late when they tried to revamp it later. I think it's a similar idea, which is that at the end of the day, just like I'm arguing that digital DNA needs to be in organizations, doesn't matter which domain you're in. You need to know your domain, but you need to know these broad trends like digitization or now AI, and be tooled up to be able to leverage that in your work. So I think, it's possible. Companies have done it around digitization, been forced to do it in many cases, and it's necessary as well. And that's true not just for whether it's digitization or AI, or even the science of decision-making, analytics and management science, and these kinds of approaches as well.
But I think what you're suggesting is that someone who perhaps knows less about technology, but has this mix of technology and business, is in a better place than someone who is an expert in tech and doesn't know business. Well, what is it that we bring to the table in the world of theory? Why is it that we think academics can help these business people to make better decisions? You studied in, Herb Simon was there at Carnegie Mellon
I took his
when you
course
were
from
there.
him. Yeah.
And he's kind of, I mean, he's kind of like the test case of someone who really understood management, economics, and tech, right? And so we all would love to be like, Herb Simon to some degree. But
Yeah,
what
I
is it?
think,
What is it that the academics bring, and an understanding of organizational design and economics and so forth?
yeah. And Herb Simon, of course, was a legend. I took his course. And for your listeners who are less familiar, Herb Simon got the Nobel Prize in Economics, Turing Prize in Computer Science, and also the highest award in psychology as well. So, a rare individual to scale the peaks of multiple fields and disciplines. And I guess coming back to your question of, what is it that that say academics can add to this discipline, or why is there even a research field within business schools, right? Why not people coming and sharing war stories from their time running businesses and so on? And back in the day, that's what business schools were. People came in and shared their war stories. Here's what I did at my company, and look at where it is, and so on. And the nice thing about it is that you have people who are practicing, who are coming and sharing, here's what happened. The catch with it is you have a sample size of one, and you would have one person walk in with one war story saying, here's how I ran my company, and I'll make something up, you know, uh, highly centralized. I ran everything, I controlled everything, deeply immersed in all aspects of the business. So you need to be, what's called founder mode today. You need to be all in and in everything. And then somebody else comes in and shares their war story about a success, and they say, oh, I delegated, I empowered, and they did everything. And the leader's job is you shouldn't be making more than 2-3 decisions a year and empower your team. Your job is to hire the right people and motivate them and let them make decisions. Now you're like, which one's right? And so that's where the science of management comes in, which is what can we learn by studying hundreds of businesses? Can we collect data from hundreds or thousands of companies and look at what are the patterns? And then you start to notice here are the circumstances or the types of conditions under which maybe a more centralized decision making structure works. Here are the circumstances where decentralized structures work. That, by the way, is not my area of research. So I don't know the answer to that question. But when it comes to even digitization, like in my field, people have studied a range of questions like, what is the impact of IT investments on productivity? For a long time, back in the 80s and 90s, people were observing that companies were investing in technology but not seeing the results. And then over time, it became clear that there's a lag, that there's a J curve and the returns come in later, but you also need to build in these other capabilities. How do you learn all that? It's not somebody coming up with a war story and saying, here at my company, we did this way and it worked, and therefore it's a rule or a maxim. It's by gathering data from lots of companies and analyzing the data to study the patterns. And in fact, beyond that, there are people who do theoretical work, it's theorizing. And then you present the theory, and your fellow academics then test those theories in the wild. So it's very much working with companies, bringing data. The modern analytics craze in industry, I would argue, has primarily come out of academia. We've been teaching our students, our MBA students, other students that there's a big value for data. You can use data to drive decision making, and that has seeped into organization culture. And so you see some of that science entering as well.
Well, you can tell if somebody's been to a good business school because the answer to every question you ask them is it depends. And that really comes out in this book. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people who are spending a lot of time warning us about the pitfalls of machine intelligence, and they feel like their job is to kind of suppress the hype. And then, of course, I've also interviewed people who believe that their job is to hype up, right, machine intelligence and talk about all the great things that can do it. And what comes out of almost every page of your work is this idea that, well, there are these trade-offs, right? And what I also liked about the book is this idea that, you remind us that when it comes to algorithms, I mean, humans use algorithms, right? I mean, human decision making is also algorithmic, right? In the sense that we also, use rules. And I love this metaphor of nature versus nurture. I mean, I'm rushing through all the themes of the book, but I mean, do you think it's hard to maintain sort of a balanced perspective because everybody wants to be either an advocate or a critic?
Yeah, I would say it's very hard to have a balanced perspective here. People get attention for taking extreme views. And so it's easier to have people, give you a platform when you take an extreme position. Those extreme positions also will get uh, shared a lot and so on. When my book came out, and I came up with some early warnings around AI powered decision making. And I also brought a lot of themes around governance structures in it. But when I was doing my book tour, I remember that there were at least a couple interviews where I was invited to these interviews paired with other people um, who were extremely negative about it and essentially had the view that this is going to destroy mankind, humanity, and blah blah blah. And I was paired with them, and then in those conversations, I have to be the voice of reason and make the case that look, things there's no out. It's not that there is an inevitable outcome here. This is something we shape. And today, in these early innings, I think there are many possible outcomes. But based on the choices we make, we will shape the future. And it is very much in our hands. And so I don't think we should have this sense of we've lost agency. Uh, if we are passive about it, we will lose agency. And I've provided many examples of how today algorithms drive our decision making on like Amazon, making purchases, what we watch on Netflix, what we watch on YouTube, even how much time we spend on YouTube or TikTok because the algorithms are influencing us. So there could be a loss of agency, but at the end of the day, it is for us to shape how we want these technologies to be used. And so I think anyone who is you know, ultimately an ultra optimist about algorithms and AI, and anyone who's ultra pessimistic about it, my response to it is neither outcome is inevitable. I think both outcomes are in the set of possibilities. And if we take this all seriously, I think we can actually influence outcomes.
Yeah, I know you're a fan of Pedro Domingos, and he's basically made the point that all of the different tools in our toolbox, they have human analogs, right? All of the different types of pattern recognition that we're creating with machine intelligence. I mean, we do similar types of pattern recognition with our carbon based processing.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think we make too much of this dichotomy? Do you think we should be thinking more in terms of a unified approach to decision making?
Yeah, I do think that we need a unified approach. And that's kind of where my research currently is in thinking about human AI collaboration and
Hmm.
thinking through how do you design systems that have humans and AI in there, and what is the perfect configuration of the system. We have decades of research on designing human systems, organization design, what is the right organization design, how do we evaluate, how do we motivate employees and all of that stuff. But we know very little about how to design human AI systems. For example, what should humans be doing? What should AI be doing? What is each good at? What would drive not just productivity, but also worker satisfaction? So, where would they feel they have lost agency? Those kinds of questions. But I think we need to be thinking about a unified system. And it's not, we are, I think this view of the world as being human alone or AI alone, I don't buy either of those arguments. I think the human alone, I think that ship has sailed. There's no point resisting, AI. I think the question is how do you board this train and shape the direction where it's headed? And I think this view that, it's all automation and, we'll have mass human replacement by AI. I think at the end of the day, we shape that outcome. We need to be actively involved in shaping that future where AI is empowering us and augmenting our work, and we design these human AI systems in a more deliberate manner.
Well, what does that mean for the organization of the firm? I mean, historically, we had these CTOs and CIOs who were sort of in charge of the IT stack, and then we had all the other folks, right? And it was sort of like I don't know, a division of labor, and also a lot of the CIOs, CTOs came from more of an engineering background, and all the other C folks came from the business background, and I just did a project recently for a big, actually it was a Philadelphia-based company, and the the realization that we came to was that every employee works for IT now. Like, and the job of IT is not to come up with these solutions, but to really provide the tools to all the people in the organization so that they can sort of devise solutions. Do we need to kind of revisit that sort of divisionalization, the functional divisionalization that we've kind of inherited from back in the days when, you had servers over here and somebody had to maintain them and so forth?
Yeah, I think we'll have to revisit it. I feel like we're going to end in a world where the CTO/CIO org is at the center of almost every function of the organization. It's like a hub and spoke model. They're empowering every organization. They're actually involved in the work design of
Yeah.
every team within the organization. So yeah, the idea that you had, back in the day, like I call them the .com people, or let's say the engineering team that's sitting somewhere that they do the stuff. And whenever my computer is not working, I call and say, hey, what's going on? Or whenever I need a software, I say, hey, I need this. We're already well past those days. We're already in a world where the CTO and CIO, I mean, we gave them C-level titles from VP of engineering to convey that, look, this is strategic to the organization. Increasingly, I think the CTO CIO role is no longer going to be just managing the engineering aspects, but it's going to be designing aspects of every team's workflow, workplace design in some ways. And so they're going to be super central. So I do imagine that there's going to be a big change. And it's possible. You brought up how CTO CIOs have all historically been engineers. And there's good reason for that. But I think in the future, we may also start to see CTO CIOs who are non-engineers, but who understand technology. You still need that. You still need a lot of that, but who maybe understand other aspects of organization. Or you have technologists who have very deep understanding of strategic aspects of the business, who are able to play that role. I think ultimately, as we started to see automation and augmentation of different tasks in the work, everyone, marketing will need the CTO's help to redesign how marketing gets stuff done. Sales will need the CTO's help to redesign how sales gets done, and so on for every function. So it's, maybe one day we'll start to see CTOs as CEOs as well, because they're going to be more and more the center of the organization going forward.
Yeah, in the book, you talk a lot about how there is this cultural aspect where people tend to view algorithmic decision making by machines differently from human decision making. So I find this interesting in a couple ways. First of all, the idea that people think of this in a dichotomous way, right? Like, it's either the algorithm that fired me, or it was the human that fired me. It was either the algorithm that was driving or the human that was driving. And, that's clearly a crude simplification. But the other thing is that it seems like there are some people that have this faith in the algorithm and a bias in favor of the decision making. And then other folks have a bias that goes in the other direction, right? Where they're very suspicious or averse to the decisions made by the algorithm. I mean, how can they both coexist? Is there a way of sorting out like who has which bias?
Yeah, look, I think we need a paradigm shift in terms of how we approach this question of who made the decision and how trusting I am in the decision that they've made. And we see this in many different ways. So you mentioned I talked about in the book how people view algorithm decisions different than human decisions. One simple example is, people are more forgiving when a human makes a decision and makes an error, and they kind of feel like, okay, it's human error. Fine,
Well,
let's keep
particularly when it's yourself, right? It's like
particularly when it's yourself, exactly.
yeah.
In contrast, when you have an AI system make an error, once you see it error, all the research shows that people immediately lose trust in it. So we expect the algorithmic systems to be perfect, which is an impossible bar. And when they fail, we lose trust in those systems and go back to humans. But humans are error prone. Humans are equally like black boxes as AI are. A lot of criticisms of AI based decisions are they're black boxes. There's no transparency. A neural network makes a decision. You cannot explain the decision. By the way, a human makes a decision. Even the human who made the decision doesn't know exactly why they went that way. It's a post hoc explanation, is what they generate. And they come up with an explanation. And if you have a biased decision maker, it's easy to hide behind post hoc explanations. So, in a courtroom, a judge who's biased, who makes sentencing decisions, who has, let's say, a race based bias. And then you ask them, why did you sentence this person to more years? Of course, this person is not going to say, I didn't like the race.
Right.
They're going to say, oh, here's why. And they're going to come up with post hoc explanations. So, I think the nature of a lot of these decision-making systems, whether it's biological neural networks or human neural networks, is that they are not truly transparent. Humans make up explanations. And AI also, you can come up with post hoc explanations. There's a whole set of research on interpretability in machine learning models that comes up with post hoc explanations. And I'm sure over time that's only going to improve.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about these tools is that you can actually take the tacit criteria or the implied algorithms that humans are using and surface them, right? If you have enough historical data on the decision making of an individual or of a system or a process, then you can make it explicit. And oftentimes when it's made explicit, then people are like, oh no, that's not what I'm doing. But it's pretty clear that that's what they're doing, right? I remember there's this, I think it was the SAT that got rid of the essay portion because they were graded by humans, I think. And when they tried to replicate the way in which the humans were grading them, they discovered that they were basically just giving the longest essays the highest grades. And then and of course, nobody said that. They're like, oh, it was a better essay. But once it was clear that you could replicate by just tracking essay length, then they realized that the whole thing, needed to be discarded because it was kind of a sham. So I find like, extracting a decision tree from actual human decision making is a super powerful way of kind of testing people's explicit justifications and making things more transparent.
Exactly. And the way, again, researchers in academia make sense of human decisions is we observe them not at an individual level, but large numbers of people make it. And then we analyze the data and we look at patterns like, oh, people prefer longer essays, or people prefer essays that have this kind of slant or that kind of slant. And that's how we notice the sense in which human decision makers are biased or not. And by the way, it's not that different with AI as well. So, for example, if you have an AI system making loan approval decisions and it says, okay, let's reject Greg's loan application, then I can run counterfactual simulations on that AI system. And I could say, it's the same application. Now I'm going to change this person's age. Next, I'm going to change this person's gender. Next, I'm going to change this person's race. Next, I'm going to change their education. I keep changing a few things and see how the AI system changes or not the decisions. And I can do this at scale and start to see, oh, this AI system, for whatever reason, doesn't like somebody's age or somebody's gender or somebody's race, and I find out that it's biased. And in fact, it's easier to run those tests on AI-based systems than on human systems. So for me, I think the opportunity is human and AI systems have certain similar capabilities, but also some very different strengths. And when you bring the two together, we can create a new decision-making system that has that hopefully brings the best of both. And you make better decisions as a result. And we can run tests on those systems. You can run systematic evaluations, and you can help human decision makers, debias them with AI support, or have AI systems be able to evaluate them or give them capabilities that human makers might have, which is sometimes looking at certain intangibles that are not captured in the data and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, what I find exciting about the research that's happening right now is all this research into AI is helping us to understand human cognition so much better. And there's like a sort of a two-way flow. And I want to dig into this with you because this nature nurture metaphor that comes from the world of human psychology, you apply it in the world of machine intelligence. But there's another dichotomy, which is smart systems versus machine learning, which is common in the machine learning and machine intelligence world. But you can also map that over onto humans, because humans also, the way we make decisions is sort of a combination of smart systems and data centric machine learning. So I mean, could you talk about those parallels? How do we take insights from one domain and map it over to the other?
Yeah, so I think there are two dimensions that you mentioned. One is this idea of which I introduced in my book, A Human's Guide to Machine Intelligence. So the framework I introduce in there is called nature versus nurture. And so that's a common.
This goes way back to the pre-Socratics. I mean, this is as old as philosophy itself.
Exactly. So this is a common way we think about human psychology. We think about, okay, there are things we're born with, nature, it's there in our genes, and there are things we pick up from the environment, nurture. And when we observe human traits, whether it is things like a person's height or weight, or their behavior, their affability, their temperament, their IQ, we can, based on these studies, figure out how much of it is nature, how much of it is nurture. And there are certain things like height, of course, which is primarily nature. There are certain things where, of course, nurture plays a big role. So I take that analogy and I apply it to our algorithmic systems. And I kind of say, look, I think the creator of the algorithm is the human engineer, and they give the systems certain behaviors, and that's the nature of the system. So they've programmed certain rules, and they code in these rules. I mean, any of us who have written software know, you put in these rules. If this happens, then this happens. These if-then rules, or other ways in which we create those software systems. So then that's nature. Before ML systems, almost all software was primarily nature, meaning it was the engineers who coded exactly what action the software should take under which circumstance.
In the animal world, it would be like all instinct, right?
All instinct, yeah.
Instinct.
Yeah, all instinct, nothing you're picking up from the environment, let's say. Now, the equivalent of nurture, where you observe and you pick up from the environment, in the machine learning example, is where you give a machine learning system a training data set, and you say, learn from this, and that's the environment. And the system is not being programmed explicit rules, but the system is looking at the data and then learning patterns in the data and figuring out what actions to take. And increasingly, our software is moving towards that world, because if you build these systems based on pure nature, it's hard to build complex systems. If I want to build a system to help do taxes for you and I, Greg, it could be all nature, meaning an engineer kind of codes into the system all of the tax rules and kind of says, okay, if this person's state is California and their income is this much and this other criterion is met, then the tax should be this, and so on. We program those rules. But now I want to create a system that can go drive a car. We can actually write all kinds of rules in there. But when we release that car in the wild, Greg, I think you and I don't want to be on that street, because has that engineer thought through every possible scenario and everything that will come up? Instead, if we have sensors in cars, and those sensors are recording the decisions drivers are making and their environment, and we do this for lots of people, millions of miles, and that data goes into an ML system. Now it's seen lots of different situations and the choices drivers make, and it can learn from it, and that system can drive better. So that's more nurture. So tax system, you could make it work with more nature. Driving a car or facial recognition, you need a bit more of nurture, meaning a bit more of machine learning. And so we're moving towards complex systems, more nurture is kind
Yeah.
of what I was articulating.
Well, I mean, nurture comes in a couple different ways. Like in the human analogy, I mean, the stuff that happens when you're 2, 3 years old has a bigger impact maybe than stuff that happens later in life. And it seems like, especially with these foundation models, Gen AI models, I mean, the reinforcement learning with human feedback, it's kind of like, before you release it into the wild, you are giving it like education, right?
Yeah.
And that's different from the kind of training that it's going to get through user behavior, right? So that's why I think you make a distinction between sort of the users and how they kind of change things going forward, and the kind of stuff that happens maybe pre-release. So if we run our autonomous car algorithm through simulations, right? That's kind of like going to prep school, right?
Right.
Before we send them out into the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other dimension that I didn't get into, which is that if you wanted to make these systems more intelligent, how do we make them more intelligent? Now, when it comes to human intelligence, we do a bunch of things. We sometimes, as parents, we tell our kids certain rules that they shouldn't violate.
Mhm.
Sometimes they observe what's happening around them and they learn from that data on just patterns in the world. And sometimes they try stuff and see what happens and they get feedback from their environment. So, for example, my parents have taught me a bunch of rules. I've learned from that. I have seen patterns in the world. I've learned from that. Sometimes I've done good and stupid things and learn from that. So, for example, when you're a kid, you go see this other kid you don't like, you say, I wonder what will happen. Or you might say, I just feel like slapping this person. You slap this person and you get punched in the face. And now you're like, oh, okay, next time I'm going to not do that. That's reinforcement learning. You tried something, you got feedback from the environment, and you say, okay, that action to be avoided. It's the same with ML systems. You've got the rule-based systems are what are called expert systems. So that's where you codify the rules from experts. You might interview doctors and ask, how do you diagnose diseases, and codify those rules. And that's an expert system. Or you can give in just a bunch of data and you collect data on patients coming into the hospital, what were the symptoms they had, and what was the final diagnosis. And you take that data and you feed it in. That's called supervised machine learning. And you take that data and you have the system learn for that. Or you have reinforcement learning, which is where a machine learning system tries something and gets feedback from the environment. And you brought up reinforcement learning with human feedback. This is where ChatGPT might show an answer to us and we might give some feedback, a thumbs up, thumbs down, or ask it to regenerate. And that feedback is used by the system to learn that, hey, this user did not like the original answer I shared. So maybe there's an opportunity to improve things. And so that's like the example where I was talking about, a child slapping another child and getting punched in the face and saying, okay, avoid that action and maybe try something else. And so that's like reinforcement learning with human feedback.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people aren't aware of the extent to which they are providing inputs to all of these models, that they are, training them, right? Particularly the recommender engines that they are all experiencing, whether it's Spotify or Amazon or Facebook. They're getting fed this stuff precisely because they have told them, like, this is kind of what I want, right? I mean, do you think that we need to do more to educate people to be aware of the responsibility they have towards themselves, not just towards others, but towards themselves, to train these things correctly, right? I mean, if you have a housekeeper in your house and you never tell them what you want cleaned, like they're not going to know necessarily what you need cleaned. And so you need to be very conscious of the rewards that you're providing when you spend all that time watching all these videos. You're basically saying, give me more of them, right? And I think most people aren't aware of that.
Absolutely. I think there's it's about time that we think about data and AI literacy at like elementary, middle, high school levels, what needs to be taught. And there's many dimensions to this. One dimension is what you mentioned. How can you use these systems better? If you, for example, feel like let's say, I don't know, the YouTube algorithm is uh, moving you down a certain path you don't want to move down and you want to have more control, then maybe there's a way for you to go into those systems and change and even
Yeah,
provide.
you have more power than you know,
You have
right?
more power than you know. That's one piece of it, which how do you go in and give feedback to get the kinds of results you want? Then there is also just even education on, how are these systems influencing you? And, if you're not careful, you could easily be manipulated because at the end of the
Yeah.
day, a lot of these systems rely on advertising revenue or some way to keep you in that system long enough and addicted to the content and so on. So how do you address that? And then there is new issues coming up like deep fakes and so on. How do you evaluate information in this modern era? And we need our citizens to be aware and informed about how do you evaluate information. You can't just take anything that comes on WhatsApp or on some random website and take it as the truth, even if there's video evidence these days. So I think there's a broader need for education, whether it's from a self-interest, the systems will serve you better to self-protection, make sure that you're not being manipulated and so on.
I mean, do you think it's just a disequilibrium phenomenon, right? I mean, I when distilled spirits were introduced, right? Nobody knew how to handle them. So, we had in 18th century England, we had everybody drunk on gin and it was a mess. And then they had to figure out a way culturally to develop habits of temperance and stuff. I mean, do you think that it's just that the technologies are happening so quickly that we haven't developed the cultural protections and norms and knowledge that enable us to kind of maintain control over these things?
I absolutely think it's a disequilibrium issue. But there is one sense in which this disequilibrium is probably more challenging than some of the other ones that we've seen. So it is very much a disequilibrium in the sense that the rules have changed. We're still learning, we're adapting our strategies, which over time will converge us to a place where we start to use these systems better and have greater control and so on. And even things like kids and screen time, kids and social media, all of that stuff, we will sort it out hopefully in 50 to 100
Mhm.
years and have better understanding and better norms around it. But the sense in which it's different this time is the pace of change is so high, so fast that by the time you've figured out something around one change that was, or one technology that was such to you, and you've even figured that out, there's been 10 new ones that have come in. And now you need to navigate those. So there's a sense in which the environment, if it was completely human based systems being able to move at the pace of carbon, then we'll all converge to equilibrium slowly, steadily, with some friction and challenges along the way. But you've got a silicon-based system introducing change much faster, that's able to change itself at a much faster clip than humans can. So that changes. Then it's like for anyone who loves game theory, it's you've got a few agents here, but one agent is adapting and changing much faster than the others. And so I think that's also nature of the challenge.
Yeah, and you also discuss some interesting research around trust and transparency. Again, it also has applications in non-machine decision making, but the idea that a little bit of transparency is a good thing, maybe too much transparency, and I could totally relate to this story in the book about making your grading criteria super transparent. Right, the minute you offer up a very, very complex and transparent algorithm for how grades are going to be uh, assigned, then all of a sudden everybody starts gaming it and challenging it, and uh, trying to negotiate around it and so forth. So maybe I thought you could talk about that. And one other, I remember it made me think about, I hosted the chief operating officer of UPS in my class, and he talked about the Orion, algorithm. And he mentioned that if you gave the drivers the authority to override the algorithm, that's what enabled acceptance.
Yeah.
Even though they very rarely ever used it, right? They usually wound up deferring to it. But by giving them that option, that is what left them with a sense of control. But with cars, as you say, sometimes maybe you want to get rid of the steering wheel altogether. So how should we be thinking in terms of both transparency and control for optimal system design?
Yeah, I think all the research studies that have looked at what drives trust in an algorithmic system shows that transparency and user control are two extremely important variables. Of course, you care about things like generally how accurate or good is that system. Those things, of course, matter. But transparency and trust are interesting. So on transparency, the idea that you have a system making decisions for you or about you, but you have no clue about how the system works is disturbing for people. And we've seen ample evidence that people reject that system. So for example, if a professor uses an AI-based system for grading and students have no information about it, there's greater resistance to it than if the professor was grading it and the professor offered the same lack of transparency. If the professor just said, here's your grade, no information, there's greater resistance to the AI with that level of transparency. And so you do want these systems, whether that's grading or whether that's, like I said, a loan approval system that's making, or a resume screening system. You apply for a job and an AI system decides whether you get invited to the job interview or not, or AI-based evaluation of employees in a large organization. All of those settings, if a system is not transparent, people resist it. But the question is, what is the level of transparency needed? And over there, the evidence suggests extremely high levels of transparency where you break it down to all of its essentials and provide all of that. For a user, can be sometimes overwhelming to the point where it's so complex they lose trust in it because they don't understand it. And so you want to simplify that. It is useful to have very high levels of transparency in cases where you want people to be almost like testing or quality assurance
for auditing purposes.
For quality purposes. So you might want to have a certain very high level of transparency to people who will serve that quality assurance purposes. But for your lay user, you want a very simple, here, if, for example, a loan approval system, you would just say, it's a neural network based on our evaluations. We find that this neural network, the most important variable for the neural network for loan approval is a person's income. It also looks at their employment status. It cares about number of years of work experience. It cares about number of people in the household. And these are the ones that seem to move. And this is the order of importance of these variables. And that's kind of good enough. Okay, you understand what it is, and you kind of feel like, okay, it makes logical sense to me. And that makes it acceptable. You go too high, and you start to say all kinds of things about the architecture of the neural network, which neurons and the weights of all of those systems, then at that point, it's as good as, and sometimes worse than not sharing any information. So that's transparency. And control is the other interesting one you mentioned. And control, again, is one of those where people, when they have little to no control of a system that is way better than them, still will not use that system. So studies that show that if you have an AI-based system or an algorithmic system that is performing at a much higher level than humans, and you give humans the information that shows, here's your accuracy level, here's AI's accuracy level, and you've told them this is the gap, and yet you give them zero control, and you kind of say, you have to just use the system as is, no changes, the trust level is lower than if you say, look, here's the AI-based system. This is its recommendation. It's more accurate than you. We want you to use the system, but you can tweak its, let's say it's a loan approval and you're the loan officer. once in a while you can overrule it if you disagree.
Yeah.
So maybe you get a
Where
10%.
there's like a yellow band,
Yeah,
right?
there's a band,
Whereas,
exactly.
yeah.
There's you can change its decision if it gives a credit score or it gives a probability or something. You can say I'm willing to move it, or I have the
Mhm.
liberty and freedom to move it a little bit. Or if it says don't approve the loan, 5 to 10% of the times, or even 2% of the times, I can overrule the AI. Once you give that control, people are like, okay, I'll use the AI, and now you start to see that their performance is increasing and their sense of satisfaction is also high because they've got that decision support they needed without a loss of agency that they feel when they're forced to adopt a system.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like professionals, like doctors, let's say, they're the ones that they're very jealous of their control rights, right? I mean, you have to appeal to their sense of still being the boss, right? Still being in charge. I mean, it probably depends on the occupation and the profession, but certain occupations and professions, they really want, and presumably their clients and their
And
patients
patients
and
want to
customers
change.
also want to know that the doctor has the ultimate authority.
Absolutely. I think the doctors are a great example. In general, there's good documented evidence that experts actually are hard group to convince because you
Hmm.
believe in your expertise, you got there because of your expertise, you built it over time, and now you're saying, well, you may be an expert, but we still want you to use this. That's a tough sale to any expert. And so I think because a lot of expertise also relies on 90%, 95% of the cases the AI could handle, but those 5% of those cases that look different, that don't match patterns, there's some intuition that comes in that is trained over 15, 20, 30 years of doing something. And that intuition is so important. And I actually think that not only is it good in terms of winning those experts over to give them some control from a trust standpoint, it's actually good for the system so that those experts can say, look, this case looks has certain unique properties, and a system that stays trained on a million cases is not good enough to recognize certain unique aspects of this nuanced case, and I'm going to overrule the system. So definitely giving experts control helps win the trust of the experts. And as you said, it's also probably going to help win the trust of the patients to know that the doctor can overrule the AI. But also, it's actually useful because I think, again, I'm always arguing for a human plus AI system and not like a uh, AI system where a human role is very minimal.
Well, and presumably it's important to make sure you instrument things so that sort of exception then gets reincorporated back into the training data, right? If you don't have that loop, then the system can't actually improve over time.
Yeah, a good system design for AI systems would be when there's deviation from the recommended decision to have some feedback loop. It's like where in a music recommendation system and Spotify Discover Weekly or any of these other systems where a recommendation comes in, ideally you want to you want some feedback on did this person like the song or not, and if there's a way to get that feedback, whether one way it's an explicit feedback, thumbs up, thumbs down. Sometimes it's implicit, they just skipped it, or they didn't finish the song, they just left it halfway through or something like that. But you need some way to get that feedback, and that helps the system get better over time.
But of course, I mean, if we were in the Middle Ages and there were no computers, we would say the same thing, right? We would say, when there is something which is novel or which deviates from the pattern that we've seen in the past, then we want to have some capacity for our organizational decision making to improve, right? So I mean, the dichotomy between the human and the machine is in sometimes overstated, and that's why when you had this chapter on the Bill of Rights, right? And I kept thinking every single thing that you mentioned in there should apply to all decision making, right? I mean, if you get fired, right, like you should know why you got fired. And if it's an algorithm that fired you, you should know why you got fired. And if it's a human that fired you because they're in a bad mood, like you should know why you got fired, right? Should we be thinking about these, Bill of Rights? What data did the human have access to? How were they trained, and what hard-coded rules were they using? Right? I mean, should we be applying this Bill of Rights across all decision making?
That's a great point. I mean, I think and for listeners who are not familiar, the Bill of Rights is a framework I proposed in situations where an AI system is making certain critical decisions, socially important decisions, like loan approvals or hiring decisions or sentencing decisions in courtrooms and so on. Socially important decisions, when they're making these decisions, we need to make sure there are certain rights that the people who are affected by the decisions they have. And those rights are things like right to certain information, the transparency, and a few other things that I mentioned in my book. And I think you make a really interesting point, which is, don't you want those rights when humans are making the decisions? And I philosophically agree with you, which is that at the end of the day, I think making too much of that distinction between AI versus human is not fruitful. And instead, we should be thinking about what are the properties of a system that we want? What are the properties of decisions emerging from a system that we want? And it doesn't matter whether it's human alone or AI alone or human plus AI, we'll want to make sure that those properties are satisfied. And that's a good sort of goal to shoot for. So I do subscribe to that view that you're saying. The one interesting piece that I'll make that distinction is that sometimes when you have biases in human decision makers, those biases don't scale as fast and as easily as with an automated system. So if you have a judge in a courtroom that's making sentencing decisions and this judge is biased, that's affecting the lives of over the course of their career, a few thousand people, which is problematic. And of course, you want the judge to not be biased and have the judge go through training and be subject to certain evaluations and so on. And so all that is fair. But you also know that this one judge, touched only a few thousand lives. But if you now have a system that you now push into all courtrooms in the US, suddenly this one system is touching millions of lives. And so now the bar has to be higher. So it's only in that sense that I argue that AI-based systems, one, need to be subjected to a slightly higher bar because of their scale. But two, the good news is that you can actually do a lot of counterfactual simulations with them. And so another reason to subject them to a higher bar is because you can, and they're not offended. I have not had any AI system get upset with me when I've run these counterfactual simulations and walk away and refuse to talk to me. But if I sit and interrogate a judge for hours together to evaluate their decisions, that judge and I might not be in talking terms the next day. So that's the other advantage. And you can subject these systems to sort of more scrutiny in that sense.
Right. So the machine-based algorithmic decision-making without protections could be much worse, but with them could be much better than the conventional decision-making processes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I was wondering if you could turn a little bit to your current work on creativity, right? So we all know, I mean, generative AI has a lot of different use cases, many of which involve creativity. Most people are familiar with, text to text and text to image and text to code. And, there's a lot of different transformations. But a lot of people think, well, in the areas where humans are most creative, like art, artistic production, that's an area where Gen AI is never gonna match us, right? Now, maybe for functional music, some EDM and smooth jazz, yeah, fine. And maybe for some romance novels, we could probably use Gen AI. But for the really, really cool stuff, we still need the human. But again, that's a bit of a dichotomy, right? I mean, humans are going to be using these tools. So how are humans going to be using these tools to generate creative output, and in particular the world of screenplays and movie production, which is what you're involved in?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of layers to this question of what is the future of creativity with humans and AI. Excuse me. one sort of base layer to this that I'm going to make the statement is I don't think creativity is something so special that only humans can do it and AI cannot. I do believe, and we are already seeing evidence of AI writing great poems and creating great art and so on. There have been studies. There was a blind study of haiku written by AI and haiku written by Japanese masters, and AI was creating haiku at the same level of Japanese masters, and AI haiku created by AI that was screened by humans, just filtered by humans, selected by humans as this is good, this is okay, that did even better than the haiku by Japanese masters and so on. So there's, I think, evidence that AI can be creative. So that's the first thing that I'd say. Secondly, I think if we replace human creativity with AI creativity in certain basic forms of creativity, it's a given that it's going to happen. Like, for example, in ad creation, creating certain images, different taglines, generating lots of taglines, even music for the ads and so on. It's inevitable because it'll be cheaper and it's not the highest form of creativity. It's certainly something that AI um, can do, will do, and will get it done at lower cost. And so it is bound to seep into those areas. Now, when you go to the highest forms of creativity, um, that's where it gets interesting. So first of all, I think that on the one hand, we do creative things because it's a form of expressing certain core ideas. It's fundamentally a human thing. Even back during the caveman days, people were doing art in caves and so on. So it is a fundamental form of expression. So, do we want to replace that? And it's not about getting work done, it's about expressing ourselves. And so, I think creators do not want to be uh, out of those roles. At the same time, we also, I think, don't want to just be surrounded by AI created art because it's not as exciting, because the story behind the art sometimes makes the art. For example, you know, my daughter's a big fan of Taylor Swift, and I keep saying, okay, the music's okay, it's not bad at all, but um, why is this song so much better than that other song that I'll pick? And sometimes it's the story, it's Taylor Swift's story that my daughter kind of reacts to or resonates with. And so the story behind the art is sometimes very important. And if you remove the story behind the art and say, hey, I created this art form, my evaluation of the art changes as compared to Greg with a certain set of life experiences created this art. So I think there is a sense in which human created art at the highest levels will never get replaced because our assessment of the art is influenced by the creator of the art and not the output of the art alone.
Yeah, I mean, I know this guy who's making Scotch whiskey in a lab, right? And he's been able to replicate the flavors, right? So that it's indistinguishable. But people are still going to buy the story of the smoky peat and the barrels and the rainy coast of Scotland and stuff, and they're willing to pay a premium for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, art will also evolve with AI, which is, I think, a really interesting and important thing. So I have a Substack, and in fact, for your listeners, the Substack is hosanagar.substack.com, where I talk a lot about AI and work design, AI and creativity, and so on. But one of the articles I'd written at this point a couple of years ago was this big fear a lot of people had about what photography will do to art. And specifically, the fear was that art at that time, paintings, were creating very realistic paintings of the real world. And if photography can create a far more realistic version of it, why do you need a painter to create a portrait or like a still image of an apple or what have you? And when photography came in, you had two things happen. One is photography itself became a form of art. And so you have AI enabled art as another form of art that arises. but also paintings moved in a different direction. Now, you no longer had the necessity to focus on making the painting as real as possible because photographs do that. Now you could go in different directions, such as being able to capture the emotion you feel when you see the reality versus the reality. And so it went into more abstract directions and so on. And it gave birth to new forms of painting as well. And finally, the painters themselves started to use photography to capture images and to be able to help support their art as a tool within their art form as well. So I think there's going to be room for all of these forms of creativity. Human creativity will evolve in new direction. Some of human creativity will be supported by AI, and AI enabled art will also be a new form of art category at some point.
Yeah, I mean, the metaphor I like to use, my trainings in finance. So I think in terms of, active and passive investing. And, we go back to the 1960s, everybody was an active investor. And then, Jensen and Fama and all those guys came up with this idea that, the average people don't beat the average. So most people now are passive investors. But the people who are the real active investors, like, Ken Griffin or whatever, I mean, they have fortunes that could not even be dreamed of back in the 1960s. And so, as we start automating so much of this stuff, we'll create a new category. I mean, the Yo-Yo Ma makes way more money than any performing artist ever did in the 19th century, even though most of us just listen to, CDs and stuff, and we don't have a cellist in our living room. So, I mean, that could be, it's not going to eliminate the artist. It may even make those super, super special artists far wealthier and significant than artists have ever been in the past.
Yeah. I think art will survive, art will thrive, it will evolve. And, the hope is that AI can be a good tool for that art. But yeah, I don't believe again either of those two extremes. One being that AI has no role to play in creative spaces. Let's keep it out, and let's even resist AI usage. Like, for example, there are people in Hollywood who are like, "Oh, we don't want AI to enter our space." So I reject that kind of view. But then I also reject the other view, which is that AI will replace humans, and at the end of the day, AI will not be able to write and produce our favorite movies that moved us, and that required people with special experiences, special insights, and bringing in that strong human touch that ultimately we resonated with. That resonated with us.
Well, perhaps that'll be the topic of your next book, right? Creativity and machine learning. But in the meantime, this is the book, Human's Guide to Machine Intelligence. Definitely recommend it. Kartik, thanks so much for joining me.
Greg, thanks for having me.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.